Who were the Aryans? The origin of this term, ironically, lies in a scientific attempt to organize human language. In 1786, the linguist William Jones delivered a foundational speech proposing the existence of the Indo-European language family. This theory suggested that languages spanning from Europe to Iran and the Indian subcontinent all derived from a common shared ancestor. And now begins a race among linguists to name this newly found language family. This was indeed a big discovery. While the term Indo-European ultimately prevailed, several alternatives were considered. Some promoted the biblical reference, the Japhetic languages, while others, particularly in Germany, favored the term Indo-Germanic languages. The third main candidate was the Aryan language family. Scholars noted that the authors of ancient Sanskrit texts referred to themselves as Arya. The English term for that would be Aryan. From this, the inference was made that the original ancestral speakers, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, must have also identified themselves this way. As the 1800s progressed, people weren't just debating the name, they were fighting over the precise nature of this grouping. This occurred during a period of profound uncertainty. The Enlightenment had undermined the literal truth of many biblical narratives. Yet we were decades away from theories like out of Africa or a modern understanding of human evolution. There was a big gap. And as humans, we struggled to leave the unknown alone, so we tried to fill that gap with scientific racism and aggressive anti-Semitism. The result was a proliferation of profoundly strange and contradictory theories, and these theories circulated for over 150 years leading up to the Third Reich. They posited that the Proto-Aryans were exclusively white, and thus all modern white people were their descendants. A popular idea suggested that Aryans conquered India, but subsequently interbred with a native black population, which explained the brown skin of modern Indians. Conversely, in Europe, various ratios of interbreeding were said to have created all the different European nations, except for Germany, which was claimed to harbor the last remaining pure Aryans. These beliefs became increasingly bizarre. Some claimed that the sacred Indian religious symbol actually belonged to the ancient Aryan invaders, which is funny because the swastika symbol was found in the Indus Valley, and Indus ancestry makes the majority of Indo-Aryan ancestry. And no, the Indus people were not white. Were they Aryan? Well, certainly yes. Let us get back to the topic for now. There were people who argued that Jesus, despite his birth to Semitic language-speaking Jews, was miraculously an Aryan. Believe me or not, I personally know some people today who firmly believe that Jesus was Aryan. Some others even asserted that Christianity was not linked to Judaism, but rather a pure Aryan religion, descended directly from Germanic paganism. When the Nazis rose to power, their engagement with the term Aryan was surprisingly limited. Today we strongly associate them with this word, but for many of their central objectives, it was simply too broad and inclusive. Nazi academics in particular voiced objections. They understood the complexity of equating language groups with race. If being Aryan meant speaking an Aryan language, then German-speaking Jews would also be included. And the Nazi Party would never accept this. They usually preferred to use terms like Nordic race or Germanic people because it helped with their nationalism. So Aryan was in fact much rarer in Nazi propaganda. They used the term usually in a pan-European sense. The irony is that modern white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, actually embraced the term Aryan far more readily than the original Nazis did. This preference is precisely because of its pan-European connotations. The original Nazis were German nationalists and they actively despised French and Slavic people. But for modern groups, particularly in countries like USA, where white people often have ancestors from across the continent, this pan-European definition makes the term Aryan highly attractive. According to the Nazi worldview, the ancient pure race of Aryans were supposedly tall, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and originally from somewhere around northern Germany. Now, it is my observation that this claim conveniently overlaps with the corded ware culture, which the steppe theorists link to most Indo-European migrations that took place after the Yamnaya migration. In the Nazi mind, the Germans and other Nordic groups were the least mixed, purest descendants of the Aryans alive on Earth. They also had this bizarre practice of granting the title honorary Aryan to groups whenever it suited their interests. For example, they called Iranians Aryans, partly because Iranians themselves used the word Arya, and more importantly, because Germany needed Iran's oil and resources. They also granted the Japanese the honorary Aryan label. The reason likely wasn't respect or equality, it was simple geopolitics. The Japanese were allies and shared common enemies. They were far away geographically and not a direct racial threat. But the Nazis still viewed them as a distinct lower race. Their grand vision was of a world ruled by Aryans, with everyone else subordinate. In reality, their Aryan race idea was never about archaeology or history. It was pure propaganda. It was for their political purposes. And honestly, I could make a whole separate video just on how the Nazis constructed their racial worldview. But let's get back to the topic. Since the steppe hypothesis is the most popular model of Indo-European origins, which proposes the Yamnaya culture as the likely Proto-Indo-European speakers, some people equate Aryan with the Yamnaya themselves. From there you get this weird logic where people argue that groups with higher percentages of Yamnaya ancestry are more Aryan, as if Aryanness can be measured by DNA percentages. This idea is frankly absurd. Culture, identity, and language cannot be reduced to genetics. There is no such thing as Aryan DNA, no Aryan haplogroup or no genetic marker that can make someone more Aryan than another. This is a fantasy created by neo-Nazis and white supremacists who are obsessed with blood purity myths. The term Aryan was always about self-identity and language, and not about biological purity. Are Europeans Aryans? The answer depends on how we define the word, really. If we define Aryans through civilizational values, I would consider the Greeks and the Romans to be Aryans, building massive civilizations, public buildings, roads, temples, developing standardized systems of governance, cultivating large-scale trade networks, powerful militaries, organized seafaring, Neolithic farmer origins. If a civilization or a culture has these, it is an Aryan civilization by spirit. The non-Aryan peoples, in my opinion, are sometimes better than the Aryans in their own ways, because they embody freedom. They're closer to nature than the Aryans. Each of us would have an inclination towards either of these values. Some may feel more drawn to Aryan values of civilization and order, and there would be some who prefer freedom and chaos, who prefer living the primal way, to be close and connected with nature, and both of them are equally good. One of the most persistent misconceptions today is the idea that there is such a thing as Aryan genetics. People talk about an Aryan haplogroup or Aryan gene pool, but none of that really exists. The term Arya or Aryan can be understood as a cultural heritage, especially if you're Indo-Iranian, but it is not a biological racial category. This is exactly the kind of nonsense pushed by neo-Nazis and modern racial ideologues. Let us now look at what the word Arya actually meant in more detail. This is where things get really interesting, because the story of the term Arya is less about race and more about language and self-identity. The word Arya comes down to us through the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European languages. Its ultimate root may go back to Proto-Indo-European, with reconstructed forms like Aryo, Herios, Eros, which roughly meant one of our own group, a peer, or a free man. But here's the important point. Only Indo-Iranians ever used the direct word Arya as an ethnonym for themselves. Other Indo-European branches like the Celtic people and the Hittites had similar words. These show that the root existed across the Indo-European world, but only Indo-Iranians turned Arya into a proper name for themselves in a civilizational sense, and they kept using it consistently for centuries. The term Arya first shows up in the Rig Veda. There it was used by tribes like the Purus to refer to their own kin. In the same texts, you see the word Dasa used for outsiders or rival groups. On the Iranian side, the same root appears in the Avesta, where Iranian tribes call themselves Arya. Interestingly, those same Iranians also called themselves Daha, while in the Rig Veda, the word Dasa referred to them as outsiders. So you can see how the same word could be used in different ways depending on perspective. To know more about this, I have already uploaded a video on this, so you can watch that later if you want. So at its core, the word Arya originally just meant our people or our kin. And it wasn't really about race, it was more about a tribal belonging. Over time, the meaning of the word Arya evolved. What started as a simple marker of tribal identity gradually became a broader cultural and moral term. By the time of classical Sanskrit, the term Arya meant noble or honorable. In Buddhism, it gained an even more spiritual meaning. The Four Noble Truths in Pali language are literally called the Four Arya Truths, truths realized by a spiritually noble person. Here, the term Arya does not mean a race or a tribe or even a language group. It's about a person's spiritual status. So the word which once meant kinsman had transformed into a universal idea. While similar words show up across the Indo-European world, the Indo-Iranians were the only ones to carry the exact word Arya as a living identity. For them, it started as a tribal term, and then it evolved into an ethnic and cultural identity, and finally became a moral and spiritual concept. And that is why today in Sanskrit, Pali, and even in modern Indian languages, the word Arya means noble. And for the Iranic case, the country name Iran itself comes from the term Aryanam, the land of the Aryans. When people talk about Aryan origins, the most common story you will hear is the steppe one, that the Aryans come from Sintashta, from Andronovo, or maybe even directly from Yamnaya. This is according to the Kurgan hypothesis, by the way, which puts the Proto-Indo-Europeans in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This model does a good job explaining how Indo-European languages spread into Europe, but when we try to apply it to Indo-Iranians, it isn't as detailed or convincing. Now here's the other possibility. Instead of looking to the steppes, we can look south, to the Neolithic Iranian farmers. These groups were already a major ancestral source for the steppe peoples like the Yamnaya and their ancestors. And if we follow this ancestry eastward, we see it forming the Indus Valley civilization, and later it also forms the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. And this is where the evidence really matters. There is nothing Indo-Iranian in Andronovo or Sintashta that isn't already present in the Indus Valley or BMAC sites. BMAC is Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, by the way. Both archaeology and genetics show a strong continuity between Indus BMAC civilizations and their modern descendants, the Indo-Iranian peoples. It perfectly fits the case because Yamnaya ancestry is the major ancestral component for speakers of European languages. Some Southern European languages being an exception, but most other European languages are descended from the Yamnaya culture ultimately. But South Asians and Iranic peoples have their own ancestral components in higher percentage compared to the steppe ancestry that they have. The Indus Valley ancestry forms the major part of Indo-Aryan related groups, and BMAC would be the Iranic ancestral marker because it is found in higher percentage among Iranic speaking groups. If you have watched this video of mine, you would know that ancient Parthian and Achaemenid samples from northern Iran had zero Sintashta related ancestry. Well, they did have steppe ancestry, but it wasn't from Sintashta or Andronovo like we would usually expect. Their steppe ancestry comes from a different source. They carried mostly Iranian Neolithic and Anatolian farmer ancestry and were genetically close to the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. And culturally too, we see the same patterns carried forward: rituals, material culture, and symbols that connect Indus and BMAC directly with the Indo-Iranian traditions. The steppe hypothesis might be the popular theory, but popular does not always mean correct. If we look at the actual evidence, archaeologically and genetically, the Indus Valley and BMAC people themselves fit perfectly as Indo-Iranian cultures. In other words, they fit perfectly as Aryan civilizations. Now, to conclude this video, the story of the term Aryan is a reminder of how knowledge can be twisted and how myths can reshape history. What began as a simple word to refer to a kinsman has turned into a weapon of ideology. The word Arya once meant noble, not by birth but by action. In Buddhism, it came to mean spiritual nobility, someone who has directly realized the Four Noble Truths and entered the path of awakening. Such a person is free from ignorance and has begun to overcome mental defilements. It describes the inner realization and moral nobility. So if someone comes to you claiming that Indo-Iranians are not Aryans, or starts spitting some bullshit about bloodlines and racial purity, you now know exactly what to tell them. The Aryan identity isn't found in genetics or ancestry. It's found in how one lives, because the real Aryans are not a race, but a culture, not defined by blood, but by language, spirit, and shared human values. It was initially an Indo-Iranian tribal term, but it later evolved to get a better meaning. If there is anything worth reclaiming from this story, is the message that nobility is not inherited, it is earned. The Aryan ideal was never about race, it was about rising above ignorance, greed, and hatred, about seeking wisdom and living with integrity. That was it for this video. If you want to watch more videos like this, the subscribe button is waiting for you down there, and we shall meet again in the next video. Goodbye.